U.S. conceptions of property. Now, Prop 13 in 1978 can be viewed as a real turn away from that principle, but a turn that has not yet been fully realized. So we may be well in the middle of a transition to a new conception of property. But that's the current times, and I just live in it along with you. What I'm trying to describe is a conception of property that was central to the development of U.S. capitalism at the time at the end of the 19th century. So the combination of legal precedent and tax policy instituted an idea about land that it was a mobile commodity that could be held securely only by continuous improvement. I'm hoping this is clear enough, but it is to some degree by nature abstract. But if you have any questions, is there? Yes, please. Pardon? No, it was implemented by the end of the 19th century. Well before the 19th century. The exception to this, again, was a portion of the Deep South. Farms, as a result of this, did in fact become smaller, but they also became more capital intensive. Farmers were prodded into producing for sale primarily rather than for subsistence, and they were prodded to expand their rate of production and the kinds of crops they produced so they could reach an ever-widening scale of markets. That is, a farmer in Modesto who might in the 1880s be thinking about selling to his surplus produce to people living in Stockton. By the 1890s is thinking about Los Angeles and San Francisco, and by the turn of the century is thinking about New York, and by World War I is thinking about the entire world. By the 1880s, the system of commercial agriculture was dominant throughout the country, commercial agriculture, though it took different forms in different regions. In the Midwest and the Great Plains, the growth of agriculture stimulated the growth of new cities, whose services were necessary if farmers were to function as entrepreneurs operating in the global market. In the 1880s, for example, Kansas City, the population of Kansas City increased from 30,000 in 1880 to 175,000 in 1890. Paved sidewalks and electric streetcars lines were built as part of a self-proclaimed campaign that the city fathers had embarked upon to make this Kansas City, which was a railroad and shipping junction, and Kansas City was to become, quote unquote, the Paris of the Great Plains, which might seem like an astonishing claim. But at that time, what they really meant by that is that electrification, city lights, telephone poles, not cabarets and so forth. Kansas City was booming, had come into being initially because of the rapid expansion of cattle ranches in Kansas and Nebraska to the west, as well along with the development of a rail system that could quickly transport live cattle or freshly butchered meat to the Midwest and the East Coast, or through New Orleans to markets in other countries. And many of the cattle were roaming on public land owned by the federal government, and the whole operation required a minimal number of cowboys, most of whom at this stage were either African American or Mexican. For most people in Kansas City Money came from the rapid development of a city that had suddenly emerged as a transportation hub and a center for food processing. And a handful of men, a very small handful of men, controlled the cattle and trade industries, which were the original sources of wealth. But others saw opportunities to share in the new wealth that this market had created. And at the same time, more and more small farmers were successfully establishing their claims, among them the grandparents of Harold Lloyd and the parents of James Young Deere. And Kansas City developed facilities to handle the processing and transportation of cereals, along with livestock and butchered meat. So, as with many boom economies, fortunes were made simply by owning land and selling it for speculative development, flipping, to use the contemporary language. You pass on to the next owner the obligation to improve it or perish. Every boom reaches its limits, and in 1888, there was already a lot of evidence that the party was ending. In that single year, over 1,000 real estate offices failed. Kansas City's taxes were very high because voters had agreed during prosperous years to pay for extensive city improvements, which were expected to boost property values further and encourage sales at even higher prices. If it sounds like a familiar pattern, it's because we recently lived through it once more, or another variation. By 1889, many property owners were having trouble just paying the taxes they owed, and defaults were increasing. On paper, landowners were very, very wealthy, but liquidity was based on finding a quick succession of customers who were eager to participate in the boom. And when the bubble burst, Kansas City was hit with massive deflation as prices tumbled and currency was withdrawn from circulation to be moved to a safer location. At the same time, the cattle industry, which had been the original source of Kansas City's prominent position, was in trouble. The cattle industry was in trouble. Ranchers were selling off their land to small farmers who were planting wheat and corn in order to sell mostly overseas. The growth of the international agricultural commodities market would become the basis for Kansas City's next boom, which took off in 1896 and lasted for a couple of decades. But we were at this point of transition where the old cattle ranchers were losing out, and the farmers who were coming in to take advantage of the opportunities in Kansas City were entering a situation of extreme instability. Most people caught in the collapse of the Great Plains cattle market were overextended. Many had little practical experience of business, but they had very big ambitions. E. Boyd Smith was a young man from Boston who arrived in Kansas City at the age of 27 to establish the Kansas City Institute of Art. I ran into him when I was researching Americans who were living in Paris in the 19th century, and he had an amazing story, some of which involves Kansas City. He did some paintings of farm life in the Kansas City area, which we can take a look at for a bit. He was studying in Paris at the transition from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism, so he involves a little bit of both. You don't need to worry about that. The important thing is that he left a big fat diary, which allow us to understand a lot about his perspective about what was going on in the upper circles of Kansas City life. And in his diary, he observed, quote, "Society is nearly all of the dollar kind. Ignorance and money, as might naturally be expected, where so many parvenus have risen to the surface. Lying and deception in business is raised to the level of a fine art, though the same seems to hold good everywhere, possibly more prominent here. It seems to me as though it were impossible to carry on business without such tactics. I cannot help often thinking that there must be a great waste of exceptional qualifications and abilities daily taking place about us. These conclusions that he writes with great passion, personal passion, were in fact widespread in the United States in the 1880s. E. Boyd Smith would have read similar sentiments in any newspaper. And indeed, what he's doing is his personal feelings are echoing what was appearing at the time in the national press. American life was chaotic and disorganized. You couldn't count on anything to last. It was foolish to make investments because it was so easy to lose everything. Now, E. Boyd Smith was an educated man who had studied in Paris, and that's why he was in Kansas City. And also, as a result, we have his detailed account as a witness. Few settlers in the Kansas City area left substantial records of what they felt. Here and there are letters that farmers and their wives wrote that have survived. And historians have been able to piece together a more detailed picture of what it meant to be a farmer entrepreneur in the 1880s. So I'm going to be looking at a couple of other families, actually 3 other families, that were in Kansas City briefly in the 1880s, trying to build better lives for each other, for themselves. And their stories suggest that the difficulties involved a lot more than just cycles of boom or bust. Now, I don't have any pictures of these families. So what I've decided to do is show you some classic American paintings of farm life from the period. Now, as paintings, they present a somewhat idealized picture of farm life. We'll get to some photographs that were taken later. They present another kind of idealized picture. This is actually a garden in Kansas City, so that's not farm life, but part of the idea of Kansas City, the Paris of the Great Plains, being realized in painting. So, Milton and Hattie Leeper married in their Illinois home, and with the support of their families, they acquired 20 acres in southeast Nebraska, just to the northwest of Kansas City. Hattie wrote her sister how much she liked her place and looked forward to having, quote, a fine house and 100 acres under cultivation, end quote. Milton had only broken in 13 acres when hordes of grasshoppers appeared. The Leepers fled to Kansas City, and Milton went to work at a store while hiring out as a farm laborer during harvest time. Hattie sewed, she took in boarders, and she cared for chickens and a cow. Actually very common in U.S. cities at the time to have livestock in many homes. The Leepers lived on the brink of poverty, but they worked hard and they saved up $27, which allowed them to return back to their land. And they began to prosper. Well, you'd have to multiply it by about 30, a factor of 30.